Some decisions are born from the heart before the mind can protest them. The wind whispered through the barren hills of the Arizona Territory when Thomas McBride spotted the two figures staggering down the dusty road. The farmer stopped his wagon and watched intently. They were two Apache women, tall as towers, their silhouettes silhouetted against the orange evening sky. One of them limped visibly, leaning on her sister. His traditional clothes were torn and dirty with dried blood. Thomas had built his small ranch on that land 5 years ago. He was well aware of the dangers of engaging with native peoples, especially when tensions between settlers and tribes grew with each passing moon. The closest neighbors lived a journey away, and the stories that reached him spoke of bloody conflicts and cruel retaliation on both sides. But there was something about the way one of the women looked at him that touched a deep rope in his chest. It was neither supplication nor despair. It was wounded dignity, pride broken but not shattered. Thomas recognized that look. It was the same one he had seen in the mirror every morning since he lost his wife in childbirth 3 winters ago. The two sisters stopped a few yards from the wagon. The youngest, who seemed to be about 20 years old, held the older woman's arm firmly on her shoulders. Both were impressively tall, easily surpassing the height of any man Thomas knew. The eldest was bleeding from a wound in her leg, and her breathing was laborious. Thomas got out of the wagon slowly, keeping his hands visible. He knew a few words in Apache, learned during years of occasional trade with peaceful groups passing through his lands. He pointed to the wound and then to his house, visible in the distance. The women exchanged quick glances. The youngest nodded almost imperceptibly. The journey to the ranch was silent, punctuated only by the creaking of the wagon's wheels and the occasional groan of the wounded woman. Thomas helped them down when they arrived, noting how they were even more imposing up close. His hands were calloused with hard work, and his cheeks, though marked by fatigue, held a wild beauty he had never seen. Inside his modest wooden house, Thomas pointed to the sofa next to the fireplace. He brought clean water and cloths, starting to clean the wound on the older woman's leg carefully. It was a deep cut, probably caused by a sharp blade, but it had not hit any vital organs. As he worked, he noticed that they were both watching him with intense attention, as if they were recording every movement in their memories. The younger woman muttered something in Apache that Thomas couldn't fully comprehend, but the tone was one of gratitude. He just nodded his head and continued his work. When he finished cleaning and bandaging the wound, he offered them food and a place to rest. The sisters remained in their home throughout the night. Thomas slept in the kitchen chair, keeping vigilant, not out of suspicion, but out of instinct. At dawn, he found them already awake, watching the sunrise through the window. The eldest could walk better, leaning only lightly on her sister. Before they left, the younger woman approached Thomas. He removed from his neck a small amulet made of turquoise and silver, placing it gently in the hands of the farmer. His words in Apache were few, but his eyes conveyed a clear message, deep gratitude and an unspoken promise. Thomas remained on the porch watching the two figures drift away along the dusty road until they became just dots on the horizon. He kept the amulet in his shirt pocket close to his heart, without imagining that that small gesture of humanity would change the course of his life forever. The sun was already high when he resumed his daily tasks, feeding the cattle and repairing the fences. The wind blew stronger than normal, carrying with it the distant smell of rain. Thomas worked with a calm mind, feeling that he had done the right thing. He did not know that at that very moment, 200 Apache warriors were riding toward him. The horizon began to shake even before the horses' hooves became audible. Thomas was mending the corral fence when he felt the familiar vibration on the ground. At first it was just a vague sensation, like distant thunder on a clear day. Then the sound gradually grew into a dull roar that seemed to come from all directions. He dropped the hammer and walked to the center of the courtyard, shielding his eyes from the sun with his hand. What he saw made his blood run cold in his veins. A cloud of dust rose over the horizon, moving toward him with frightening speed. It was no ordinary sandstorm. It was something much more dangerous. Thomas ran into the house and grabbed his rifle, quickly checking the ammunition. He had enough bullets for a few shots, but nothing that could stand up to what was approaching. The first horsemen emerged from the cloud of dust as apparitions rising from hell itself. They were Apache warriors, riding horses painted for war, their faces decorated with red and black paints that made them look like vengeful spirits. They spread out in a semicircular formation, completely surrounding Thomas's small ranch. The farmer remained motionless in the center of the courtyard, holding his rifle firmly but not pointing it at anyone. He knew that any sudden movement could be interpreted as a threat, and against 200 warriors, resistance would be suicide. His heart beat like a war drum, but his mind remained strangely calm. One of the warriors, clearly the leader by the way the others positioned themselves around him, rode closer. He was a middle-aged man, with scars that told stories of many battles. His eyes were hard as stone, but Thomas noticed something more behind that hardness. There was pain there, a deep anguish that only a father could carry. The Apache leader got off his horse with fluid movements and walked until he stopped a few meters from Thomas. For long minutes, the two men stared at each other in silence. The wind blew between them, kicking up little swirls of dust that danced like ghosts in the warm midday air. Thomas slowly placed the rifle on the ground and took a step back, keeping his hands visible. The gesture was understood by the Apache leader, who waved almost imperceptibly. Then the warrior began to speak in his native language, his voice charged with restrained emotion. Although Thomas did not understand all the words, the man's tone and gestures told a clear story. The two women he had helped were his daughters. The pain in the leader's eyes intensified as he pointed to Thomas's house, then to the trails leading away from the ranch. The farmer understood that he was being questioned about the whereabouts of the sisters. Slowly, he pointed to the direction they had left the morning before, then gestured that they were fine when they left. He took out of his pocket the turquoise amulet that the younger woman had given him, showing it to the leader. The effect was immediate. The warrior's eyes filled with unshed tears, and he reached out to gently touch the amulet. It was clearly a family object, perhaps passed down from generation to generation. The fact that Thomas had it in his possession confirmed that his daughters were alive and that he had treated them kindly. The Apache leader turned to his warriors and spoke a few words aloud. Thomas noticed a subtle change in the atmosphere. The spears that had previously pointed in their direction were lowered, and some of the horses moved nervously, as if sensing the change in mood of their riders. But not all the warriors seemed convinced. A younger man, with even fiercer war paint, rode close to the leader and began to speak rapidly in Apache. His gestures were agitated, and Thomas could tell from his body language that he was arguing for more drastic action. The tension in the air became almost palpable. Thomas remained motionless, knowing that his fate was being decided in those moments. The sun beat relentlessly on his back, and sweat ran down his face, but he didn't dare move to wipe it away. The debate between the leader and the young warrior continued for several minutes. Other members of the group joined the discussion, their voices rising in a jumble of arguments that Thomas couldn't decipher. All he could do was wait and hope that humanity would prevail over the thirst for revenge. Finally, the Apache leader raised his hand, silencing everyone else. His eyes met Thomas's once again, and in that look, the farmer saw a decision being made. The fate of everyone there would depend on the wisdom of that man and his ability to see beyond the pain of a father in search of his missing daughters. A leader's decision can change the fate of many men in a matter of seconds. The Apache chief walked slowly around Thomas, examining every detail of the property with expert eyes. He observed the well-kept fences, the healthy cattle grazing peacefully, the simple but clean house. His steps were measured, deliberate, like those of a judge evaluating evidence in a silent courtroom. Thomas remained motionless in the center of the courtyard, feeling the weight of the gazes of 200 warriors on him. Sweat was running down his back, But it wasn't just from the heat of the midday sun. He knew that every movement, every breath, was being analyzed. One wrong gesture, one misinterpreted expression, and his life would come to an end at that very moment. The leader stopped in front of the door of the house and looked at Thomas, making a clear gesture with his hand. The farmer understood immediately. He walked to the door and opened it, inviting the Apache to enter. It was a dangerous time, but Thomas knew he had no choice. Her only hope was to prove through her actions that she had treated the man's daughters with respect and care. Inside the house, the Apache chief examined everything meticulously. He touched the couch where his daughters had rested, examined the cloths used to clean the wounds, smelled the remains of the food Thomas had offered the women. Each item was a piece of the puzzle he was putting together in his mind. On the kitchen table, the Apache found a few drops of dried blood that Thomas had not been able to wipe away completely. He touched them with his fingertips and brought them to his nose. His eyes closed for a moment, and when they opened again, Thomas saw something he didn't expect. Relief. The chief left the house and walked to the well in the backyard. He looked at the rope and the bucket, noting that they had been used recently. The water was clean and fresh, just as her daughters had described in their minds during the desperate escape. Every detail confirmed the story that the turquoise amulet had begun to tell. But the young warrior who had argued against Thomas was not pleased. He got off his horse and approached the leader, speaking quickly in Apache. His gestures were agitated, pointing to Thomas and then to the trails that led away from the ranch. His voice carried distrust and thirst for revenge. The debate resumed, this time more intense. Thomas observed other warriors splitting into groups, some supporting the leader, others aligning themselves with the suspicious young man. Tension grew like a storm gathering on the horizon. The farmer could feel that he was at the center of something much bigger than a simple search for two missing women. Then something happened that changed everything. One of the horsemen in the rear shouted something in Apache, pointing to a cloud of dust approaching from the south. All the warriors turned in that direction, their hands automatically reaching for their weapons. Thomas looked too, trying to identify what was causing such a stir. Two horses emerged from the dust, and above them the unmistakable silhouettes of the two Apache sisters. The eldest still limped slightly, but both rode with determination. They had returned. The effect on the warriors was instantaneous. Many jumped off their horses and ran toward the women. The leader, however, remained where he was, his eyes fixed on Thomas. There was something about his expression that the farmer couldn't fully decipher, but it felt like a mixture of gratitude and respect. The two sisters dismounted in the center of the circle of warriors and walked directly to Thomas. The youngest removed another amulet from her neck, this one made of carved bone and eagle feathers, and placed it in the hands of the farmer. His words in Apache were few, but his tone was solemn, almost ceremonial. The leader approached his daughters and listened intently as they recounted the events of the previous night. Thomas didn't understand the words, but he could tell from his body language that they were defending his actions, explaining how he had treated them with kindness and respect. When they finished speaking, a deep silence descended over the group. The leader looked at Thomas for a long moment, then turned to his warriors and uttered a few words that echoed through the courtyard like a decree. The atmosphere changed instantly. The spears were completely lowered, and many of the knights dismounted. The young warrior who had argued against Thomas approached slowly, his eyes still charged with suspicion. But when one of the sisters spoke directly to him, something in his expression changed. Reluctantly, he waved at Thomas in a gesture that could be interpreted as clingy respect. Thomas stood in the center of it all, holding the two amulets to his chest. He knew that something significant had happened, but he still did not fully understand the implications. All he knew was that the two women had returned of their own volition to defend him, and that had changed the whole dynamic of the situation. The sun began to decline on the horizon, painting the sky with shades of orange and red. The Apache warriors mounted their horses again, but this time there was no hostility in their movements. It was as if a storm had passed, leaving the air cleaner and the tension dissipated. The Apache leader approached Thomas one last time, extending his hand in a universal gesture of respect among men of honor. When their hands touched, the farmer felt he was sealing much more than a temporary truce. Some alliances are born from the heart and are strengthened over time. The days that followed brought changes that Thomas could never have imagined. The Apache leader, whom he discovered was called the Wounded Eagle, established a temporary camp in the hills near the ranch. It was not a hostile occupation, but rather a silent protection that extended over the property like an invisible cloak. Thomas continued his daily activities, but now he noticed movement on the distant slopes. Apache knights patrolled the borders of their land, always keeping themselves visible enough to discourage any trouble, but far enough away not to interfere with their routine. It was a demonstration of mutual respect that few white men in the region could comprehend. The two sisters, whose names Thomas learned were Crescent Moon and Morning Star, visited the ranch regularly. They brought medicinal herbs to exchange for tools, knowledge about local plants they could heal or feed, and a reassuring presence that filled the loneliness Thomas had carried since his wife's death. Crescent Moon, the eldest, had fully recovered from her injuries. Her movements were graceful despite her imposing stature, and she possessed a profound knowledge of the land that impressed Thomas. He showed him hidden water sources, edible plants growing wild, and signs of nature that could predict changes in the weather. Morning Star, the youngest, had a particular interest in the ranch's animals. He could calm nervous horses with just a touch, and the cattle seemed more relaxed in his presence. His large but delicate hands worked with a dexterity that left Thomas in awe, whether repairing a saddle or preparing natural remedies. During these visits, Thomas learned more about Apache culture than many men had learned in a lifetime. He discovered that the two women were not only daughters of Wounded Eagle, but also respected healers in their tribe. They had been attacked by soldiers during a mission to collect medicinal herbs, and only their great stature and strength allowed them to escape with their lives. The amulet that Morning Star had given her was more than a simple gift of gratitude. It was a symbol of protection that identified Thomas as a friend of the tribe, a man under the guardianship of the Apache ancestral spirits. Carrying that object meant that it was safe in Apache territory, an honor bestowed on very few white men. But not everyone in the region looked favorably on these changes. Other farmers began to question the Apache presence in the hills, and rumors spread to nearby towns about Thomas having made some sort of pact with the natives. Distrust grew like weeds after the rain, fueled by fear and prejudice. One day, 3 men arrived at Thomas's ranch on sweaty, nervous horses. They were farmers in the region, men he knew by sight but with whom he rarely spoke. Their faces carried a mixture of curiosity and accusation that made Thomas feel a familiar pinch in his stomach. The leader of the group, a man named Peterson, dismounted and walked up to Thomas with deliberate steps. His eyes constantly panned the hills, looking for signs of the Apache presence that everyone knew was nearby. The conversation was tense from the start, with Peterson asking direct questions about the nature of Thomas's relationship with the natives. Thomas responded honestly, explaining how he had helped 2 injured women and how it had resulted in unexpected protection. But his words seemed only to increase the visitors' distrust. To them, any association with Apaches was treason to one's own race, regardless of the circumstances. Tension increased when Peterson suggested that Thomas was putting all the farmers in the area in danger by maintaining friendly relations with the tribe. He argued that the Apaches might have been using the ranch as a base to plan attacks against other settlers, and that Thomas was naive to trust them. During this heated discussion, Thomas noticed movement in the nearby hills. Several figures on horseback emerged from the trees, positioning themselves at strategic points around the ranch. There were not many, perhaps a dozen warriors, but their presence was immediately noticed by the 3 visitors. Peterson and his companions instinctively retreated closer to their horses, their hands moving nervously toward the guns. The air was charged with tension, like moments before an electrical storm. Thomas realized that he was at the center of a situation that could erupt into violence at any moment. It was then that Crescent Moon appeared on the trail that led to the ranch, walking quietly as if it were just an ordinary social visit. Its majestic and calm presence had an immediate effect on the atmosphere. The warriors in the hills remained alert, but made no threatening moves, while the farmers were visibly impressed by their stature and dignity. She approached Thomas and gently placed her hand on his shoulder, a simple gesture but loaded with meaning. It was a clear demonstration of protection and alliance, a silent declaration that any threat to Thomas would be considered a threat to her and her family. Peterson and his companions understood the message immediately. They mounted their horses quickly, casting nervous glances at the hills before setting off toward their own estates. His last words were a veiled warning about the consequences of associating with enemies of white men. As the visitors disappeared into the distance, Thomas felt that he had crossed an invisible line. It was no longer simply living in frontier territory. He had become part of something bigger, a bridge between two worlds that rarely understood each other. And he knew that this position would bring both protection and danger in the days to come. The true value of a decision is revealed only when time tests it with fire. The following weeks brought a growing tension that hung over the entire region like a storm cloud. Thomas noticed more frequent movement in the hills, and Wounded Eagle visited the ranch twice, always with a grave expression. During one of these visits, Thomas understood through gestures that army soldiers were approaching the region. On the morning the soldiers arrived, Thomas was repairing the roof when he heard the unmistakable sound of a military column. He quickly descended and walked to the center of the courtyard, just as he had done when the Apache warriors first appeared. The captain leading the troop was a hard-eyed young man. He got off his horse and approached Thomas with a rigid posture. His questions came swiftly and bluntly about the rumors of Apache activity in the region and any communication Thomas might have had with the natives. Thomas responded carefully, explaining about the two injured women he had helped and how it resulted in unsolicited protection of his property. The captain was not satisfied. To him, Apaches were enemies to be eliminated, and any settler who had relations with them was committing treason. During the search of the property, a soldier found the Apache amulets that Thomas was carrying. The captain examined the objects with an expression of triumph, declaring Thomas under arrest for collaboration with hostile forces. At that moment, Crescent Moon and Morning Star emerged from the trail, walking with the dignity of queens. Behind them, Wounded Eagle rode slowly, followed by only two warriors. The soldiers pointed their guns, but Wounded Eagle raised his hand in a gesture of peace. He dismounted and walked to the captain, speaking broken but understandable English. He explained that Thomas had saved his daughters' lives without expecting anything in return, acting with rare kindness. He stated that any action against Thomas would be considered action against his family. The captain was confused. He had come prepared for a military operation against hostile warriors, but found an Apache family peacefully offering to protect a white settler. Crescent Moon placed his hand on Thomas's shoulder, declaring him his family's adoptive brother through words translated by his father. The tension in the courtyard was palpable, but the serenity of the Apaches created an atmosphere that no one wanted to break with violence. Then Morning Star did something that changed everything. He approached the captain and held out a small bag of medicinal herbs to heal gunshot wounds. It was an offer of peace, demonstrating that they did not see the soldiers as automatic enemies. After long minutes of silence, the captain made a surprising decision. He ordered his men to lay down their arms and declared that he had found no evidence of hostile activity on the property. The amulets were returned as personal objects with no military significance. Wounded Eagle nodded respectfully and mounted his horse. Before leaving, he looked one last time at Thomas, and in that gaze was a silent promise of continued protection. The two sisters said goodbye with hugs that showed genuine affection for the lonely farmer. When the soldiers left and the dust settled, Thomas remained alone in his courtyard, holding the amulets to his chest. The silence of the afternoon was different now, charged not with loneliness, but with deep peace. In the distant hills, an eagle flew in circles before disappearing over the horizon. Thomas smiled for the first time in a long time, knowing that he had found a family in the most unlikely place, the human heart, when it chooses goodness over fear. If this story of the Wild West has touched your heart and you want to follow more exciting adventures of courage, honor, and redemption in the arid lands of the American frontier, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and activate the notification bell.